Hi, my name is Sakshi Aki, and today on my author's discussion, I will be speaking on the historic Martin Luther King Jr. So to start with his early life, he was born on January 15th of 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. He was the second of third children, and his first name was actually Michael after his father, but then they later decided to change it, which is when he became MLK Jr. But he was very young when that occurred. So MLK Jr. and his siblings were born into a financially secure middle-class family, and so they received better education than the average child of their race. So he was able to go to college, get his degree, and his parents were very supportive of his decisions and what he did throughout his life. So he also grew up in a family that encouraged him to notice and respond to injustices. And later in his life, his father and mother would always continue to support King's choices. So for the civil rights movement, it was a struggle for social injustice that took place mainly during the 1950s and 1960s for Black Americans to gain equal rights under the law in the United States. So this entire thing kind of started when, in 1955 on December 1st, the modern civil rights movement began when Rosa Parks, who was also an African-American woman, she was a seamstress, and she was arrested for refusing to move to the back of the bus in Montgomery, Alabama. So essentially, she was sitting in the colored section of the bus, and when she was asked to move, she refused to do so, which kind of sparked the civil rights movement. So Martin Luther King Jr., who was a little-known 26-year-old Baptist minister with a doctorate from Boston University, led the boycott. So during the boycott, he began to rise to national and international prominence to the US civil rights movement, drawing on his study of nonviolent civil disobedience and the teachings of Henry David and Mahatma Gandhi. King delivered a message of nonviolent protest against racial injustice in eloquent, powerful sermons and speeches. So this is a quote by him that I thought was important to mention. There comes a time when people get tired of being segregated and humiliated. If you will protest courageously and yet with dignity and Christian people who injected a new meaning and dignity into the veins of civilization, this is our challenge and our overwhelming responsibility. So this kind of ties hand in hand with the Montgomery bus boycott, which I will be speaking on next. But Rosa Parks was the one that kind of inspired the civil rights movement to occur, and MLK Jr. took charge in doing so. So the Montgomery bus boycott took place in March of 1955. So Rosa Parks' arrest sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, during which the Black citizens of Montgomery refused to ride the city's buses in protest over the bus's system's policy of racial segregation. So by mid-November 1956, the US Supreme Court based its decision on the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection under the law, ruled that segregated Republic buses were unconstitutional, and the boycott was a success. So I believe this boycott this entire process was about 351 or 361 days. So it definitely was a good year almost. But in the end, it was all worth it because it did end up being successful. It's saddening that it did take as long as it did, just for people to get the equality that they deserve. So another important thing that Martin Luther King Jr. was a part of was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So in early January of 1957, the leaders behind the Montgomery bus boycott assembled in Atlanta, Georgia, and founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or for short, it's the SCLC. And the founding members of this conference were Ralph Abernathy, Bayard Rustin, Fred Shuttlesworth, Joseph Lowery, and of course, Martin Luther King Jr. So this group was made in order to have a regional organization that could better coordinate civil rights protest activities across the South. So essentially, it was giving them a name, a group of people that would protest and fight for equality and freedom for colored people. So this SCLC comprised churches and clergy from across the South and was created to coordinate protests inspired by the success of the bus boycott. As its president of this SCLC elected Martin Luther King Jr., for he had played, a large part in this creation. He was one of the founders. He did much of the SCLC's funding by preaching and speaking in the North as well as the South. So this led to the march in Washington. So on August 28th, 1965, more than 250,000 people participated in the historic march on Washington for jobs and freedom, gathering near the Lincoln Memorial. The purpose of this march was to advocate for the civil and economic rights of African Americans. They also did this march in Selma, and he delivered the historic "I Have a Dream" speech, to which he called for an end in racism in the United States. This is the iconic speech that we all know of, in which he just wanted equality for his people, equal treatment. He didn't want any segregation, and he wanted to do so in a very nonviolent manner. He was very he advocated for nonviolence. So the letter from Birmingham jail is also a very important piece. So in April 1963, MLK Jr. and the SCLC joined with Birmingham in a massive direct campaign to attack the city segregation system by putting pressure on Birmingham's merchants during the Easter season. Unfortunately, in doing so, hundreds were arrested. So King spoke to Black citizens about the philosophy of nonviolence and its methods, and extended appeals for volunteers at the end of mass meetings. So with the number of volunteers increasing daily, which was great for them, actions soon expanded to kneel-ins at churches, sit-ins at the library, and a march of the country building to register voters. Hundreds were arrested, unfortunately, including King. So on April 12th, MLK Jr. was arrested after violating the anti-protest injunction and was kept in solitary confinement. So King writes, and I quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." It says that people have a moral responsibility to break unjust laws and to take direct action rather than waiting potentially forever for justice to come through the courts. Responding to being referred to as an outsider, King wrote this quote right here. Unfortunately, at 6:05 p.m. on Thursday, April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was shot dead while standing on a balcony outside his second floor room at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. I believe it was a direct shot at the lower right side of his face, which was, I think, very critical. So he was rushed to the hospital, actually by this the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The other members were the ones that were around him and that took him to the hospital. But unfortunately, the damage had been done and he was pronounced dead at 7:05 p.m. that day. After much searching and all the clues that were given, it was said that James Earl Gray was the man that had shot him. It was said that he was a fugitive that had escaped Missouri prison, but most people still say that this is up for debate, and there was a lot of controversy after Martin Luther King's death, if whether or not it was James Earl Grey or somebody else. So we're not, I don't know, 100% sure, but at that time, all the evidence pointed towards James Earl Grey that assassinated Martin Luther King Jr. So this is a little, picture of this casket. So MLK Jr.'s impact on the people. So believe it or not, after his assassination, there was a lot that happened all around the United States. So news of King's assassination prompted major outbreaks of racial violence, resulting in more than 40 deaths nationwide and extensive property damage in over 100 American cities. 100. James Earl Grey, so the 40-year-old that escaped, later confessed to the crime and was sentenced to a 99-year prison term, which I think later on he got death row. So during King's funeral, a tape recording was played in which King spoke of how he wanted to be remembered after his death. I quote, "I'd like somebody to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others." So over the course of a dozen tumultuous years, King helped to reimagine America's collective moral and political imagination, in which he successfully argued in the letter from Birmingham jail in April 1963 that racial injustice comprised one of the fundamental principles of American democracy. He amplified this argument 4 months later at the March on Washington in a speech whose more radical impulses were quickly overshadowed by an extemporaneous detailing of the dream he had envisioned for the American nation state. So that's referring to the "I Had a Dream" speech that he gave. More than 100 million Americans watched this televised funeral broadcast over 3 major networks, and Johnson, who did not attend the funeral, ordered flags on federal buildings flown at half-staff. Many presidents also spoke on this. At the time, it was John F. Kennedy, who also unfortunately was assassinated 5 years after MLK Jr.'s death. Overall, Martin Luther King Jr. was a very, he was someone that colored people looked up to, and he was a leader for them, a voice for them. And, even though racial injustice still lives on today, the time that he was alive, he did whatever he could to get equality for his people or for everybody, because that's the least that everyone deserves. And he did so in a non-violent way, which is very appreciated across the nation. And yeah, thank you so much.